Okay, so for the render properties, if you go over to here, we have the render properties tab. So click on that and then we go to check all the render settings to make sure that they're all ready to go. So we have cycles, we have supported, and we have GPU compute. If you do not have a GPU, you can use CPU. It will be slower, but it will work fine. With sampling, we've gone over these slightly already, but just as a recap, the noise threshold is at 0.01 and the max samples is set to 1024. And if you remember, when we do a rendered preview, so let's go to here and we can see, let me just actually decrease the, decrease the geometry nodes for the viewport because it's a bit slow, so 0.1 should help speed everything up. So we can see that the samples are increasing over time to get to 1024. Now, honestly, for the viewport, there's probably going to be too many. We could probably just set it to 250 and that will creep up to 250 and then stop. Now we also have denoise settings here, which we've gone over. So over time, once it hits 150 samples, it will start denoising the image so we can get to the final result much quicker. Now denoising doesn't mean that it can fix any image. So if we set this to, for example, 2 samples, and we set the start denoising to 0, we can see that the denoising has already kicked in. The noise isn't very obvious and it's kind of trying to smooth everything out, but it still looks very strange. It's kind of paintery. But if we increase this to maybe 10, and watch that go to 10 samples, the denoiser will be able to do a much better job because there's a lot more information in the render. So 8, 9, 10. So this will start clean up more and more and more and more. The more information that the denoiser has about the image, the better the denoising is going to do. So with that in mind, let's move on to the render settings. So if you remember, this is set to viewport, and this is the viewport here. So let's check the render settings. So the render settings here are going to reflect when you press the render button. So render image, or F12, and we can see the render image. So what it's going to do here is going to take these settings instead. So we can just close that for now. We don't really want that to happen. And let's go through. So we have it. I'm going to set it to max samples 512. That's probably more than enough for this scene. And this can change depending on your scene. So it's sometimes, if there's a scene with a very, very small light or a very, very small window letting a lot of light into that scene, you're going to need a lot more samples. It will take a lot longer for the image to clean up. It's almost like if you've ever used a camera, when you take a photo at night time, that your phone camera will be a lot more noisy than in the daytime. The images generally at night time are a lot harder to make better quality. And that's the same case here. So if it's a lot darker image, you might need more samples, and that is very dependent on the scene. And generally you'll have to do a lot of tests before you do the final render to see what are the optimal render settings for this particular project. But for here, I think 512 should be enough. And we also have a denoising button here, which has a few settings, but I'm not going to use these because when you click this this denoise button here, once it's finished rendering, so if I set this to 10, go into render, then if we wait for this to get to set 10 samples, it will then denoise this image. Okay, so this image has now been denoised, and you might think that that's a good idea, but now we can't go back. So let's say that it has denoised too much and it's kind of broken apart the image. So maybe some details like here are kind of blurring into the background and we can't see this solid line that should be here. And that means that is stuck into the image and nothing we can do can go back to change that. So we can denoise with another step. So what I'm going to do is just close this. I'm going to disable it here. Now, I will come back to the denoising in a second, but for now, let's just go back. Let's continue through the render settings, and then I'll come back to this in a minute. So with light tree, this isn't so important. We can ignore this for now, but this is basically going to help when there's a lot of small lights in the scene, but we can just leave that on for now. I don't think there's any other settings that we need to change. I've set indirect to 0, filter glossy, that's all good. And for light path max bounces, yeah, I've just set these all to 32. And I think that should be fine with AGX high contrast. I think that's all the settings we're going to need. So let's move on to the next step. So let's go to output settings. Now the output settings are kind of important because depending on the image that is saved, so if you save as a TIFF or an OpenEXR or a PNG or a JPEG, can determine how much information is going to be in the image for you to do editing later. Now in this tutorial, I'm not going to cover editing too much because I think that should be in a totally separate tutorial, because I generally do that inside of Photoshop, but we will do some edits inside of Blender, so the final output isn't going to be super important. But just so you know, an image like TIFF or OpenEXR or PNG at 16-bit, they're going to have a lot more information in the image, so when you do your editing, you'll have a lot more freedom to change the image how you want to before you save it out as a smaller image like a JPEG for the internet. Right then, and sorry, now for the denoising settings. So what we're going to do here is click on View Layer, and under Passes, we're just going to scroll down to here and click on Denoise Data. So now when we render the image, it's going to save separate denoise data that we can denoise after the image is rendered, and we can determine how much of the denoiser we want to actually use afterwards. We can also enable mist. That is going to allow us to add a kind of mist to the image. So I'm going to turn that on, but that's going to be determined by the actual camera settings. So let's click on the camera settings and go through this just to have a look. So we can enable mist, and we can see there's a point over here and a point over here. And that's going to tell us that we want the mist to start at this point, and we can make the mist end at this point. And we can change that by going to the World tab. We can click on Mist Past, and we can tell it maybe we want the mist to start at 0, and we want it to end at this part. But generally what you want to try to do is try to get the whole image in, so we can make it just start around here and maybe start around 0. So basically the whole mist is going to be included here. So as it goes through, it's going to get more and more and more misty to the end point where it's going to be 100% mist. Okay, let's go back to this tab. And then we do have some other settings here, but I don't think we're going to need this for this particular project. But this allows us to extract various different parts of information about the image. So if I just enable this one for now, so we can just see how that's going to look in the final image. And there's other things like creating masks like crypto map, which we don't really need to go over in this tutorial. So with denoising data and mist enabled, there's actually one final setting I completely forgot to check, and that is going to be the depth of field for the camera. So I'm going to enable depth of field, and then I'm going to set the focus point to be the chair. So now if I go to rendered view, we can see that the chair is going to be in focus and the background is going to be more out of focus. I think the 2.8 is going to be a little bit too low, so I'm going to set this to something like 5.6, and that's going to mean that more of the image is going to be in focus. It's a bit hard to tell with this image right now, but I think that should be fine. So the focus area, if I enable limits, we can see that this is telling us that the focal plane is going to be right here, and I think that's fine. And now I think that we're ready to render the image. Let's just do a final check. So we got the samples. Oh, sorry, let's set this back to 512. And the reason why I'm doing this as a square number is because I believe that the denoiser is trained on images which are rendered to a set amount of samples. So a square number of samples like 128, 256, 512, 1024, and so on. So I'm going to set this to 512. And we can just, so I think that's fine. We're going to output as, I think just a PNG is fine. And view layer, these parts. So that's good for me. So I think that we can get ready to render. Let's press F12 and we can render the image. Okay, and this is the final image. And I do think that the background, the plaster is a little bit too bumpy. And now that we've done a final render, we can actually see that. And this will happen when you do final render. You might then notice other things that need to be changed. But we can see now that the background is going to be slightly out of focus because we enable the depth of field on the camera. And that adds a little bit more realism to the render. So that's great, but I am going to change the plaster now. So let's just click on this one. And let's just go to here, click on the object. And I want to set this 2.5. I believe I tried to actually do this earlier in the project, but I didn't realize that my number pad was turned off. So let's put this to 0.5 and then we can do a re-render. On my RTX 3070, it took 3 minutes to render. So let's just render that again. Okay, great. So that has now finally finished and this is looking a lot smoother and a lot more realistic. It's not too bumpy. Right then, but what we can see is that the image is still noisy. We still have all these sparkly bits and that means it needs to be denoised. And if you remember, we did enable some denoise data. So let's extract that now. So what we can do is click on this one and then go to Compositor. Or if you wanted to, we can click on Compositing tab over here. But I always prefer to just create my own interface. So what I'm going to do is just with Compositor enabled, I'm going to click use nodes, and then we can see some more information about the final render. So this is our final render. How do we view that properly? So we could just go over to here and click on UV editor or image editor, and we can click on type in render result. Now we can do that in both of these, in the UV editor or the image editor, but now we can see the final image here. Now you can also view a backdrop in here, so we can actually see the rendering inside the compositor at the same time, but this is for some reason the workflow I've always done, and it always just works for me. So with this set to image editor and this one set to compositor, what we're going to do now is just try to get some information about the denoising. So let's go over to here. We can see it's noisy, and we can see here we have some denoising information. So what I'm going to do is do Shift A and type in denoise, and then what we can do is plug in the information. So I'm going to plug the image into image, I'm going to plug the normal into normal, and then the albedo into albedo. Then I'm going to plug that image into the image output, and this is the output of the compositor. So we can see here it's thinking now, and it will be denoising the image. And now we can see the image has denoised. And I find that this denoise node is far more accurate than using the denoise button here. And like I mentioned earlier, we can actually go back and change this if we wanted to. So let's say we find that it's denoised a little bit too much, we can mix the two together. So if you remember, this is the non-denoised image, and this one here is the denoised image. If I was to do Shift A and then just type in mix, we can add a mix color. So what we can do here is bring this one into here, and then bring this one into here, and then bring this one into here. So now what we're going to have is a slider which allows us to slide between this one and this one. At 1 it's going to be 100% this one, and at 0 it's going to be 100% this one. So the denoiser is a little bit slow. I wish that it was a lot faster, but there we go, we can see it's denoised. And if I put this to something like 0.75, it's going to be mostly the denoised image, but then 25% the non-denoised image. So there we go, we can start to see some noise coming in, but that is basically the freedom that we get by simply using the denoise node rather than denoising 100% into the image. So for now, I'm just going to use this one because I don't really need any others. Now, what you do notice is that with the denoising at 100%, that some areas are going to start to get blurred in together. So I don't think that we added enough samples in the render. I think 1024 would enable us to get a totally clean image, but for the purposes of this video and for social media, no one's going to look at that image close enough that I think that's probably going to be fine. Now, as you'll remember, I did also enable a mist pass. So if I plug this one into the image output, we can see how that looks. So there we go, this is a mist pass. So this is a great way to add some realism, especially to outdoor scenes, and we can mix that into the final image. Now for speed, I'm just going to move this out of the way and deal with the main image first, because the denoiser is just a little bit too slow and annoying. So let's just deal with the image and mist, and then we can come back to this in a second. So let's add a search and add a mix color. And then I'm going to add the first image here, and then the mist second. Now I'm going to set this to screen mode. You can also try add, but that I do find adds to the image, but I think that screen mode sometimes looks a little bit more realistic, because as the mist gets further and further away, it will make the background a bit darker, because mist basically does prevent light, whereas this add, for me, seems to make the background a little bit too bright. So if I set it to screen, and then I can adjust the value here. Now another thing you can do is you can put the mist pass directly into the factor, and then you can choose the color of the mist. But this is a lot more of an artistic method, and in some places it can look pretty nice. But in here, I'm just going to set this to screen. I'm just going to adjust the value here. So if I push this to 100%, we can see that it's going to be 100% misty, and turn this down, we can put this to, I think something like this looks pretty good. Now, not only that, we can adjust the mist some more. So if I do Shift A and type in color ramp, and add a color ramp, and let's plug that into here, and let's just see how that is going to look. We can control the depth of the mist and where the mist starts. So if I do something like this, the hill is completely gone, meaning the hill is completely in mist. So we can adjust this if we wanted to. So if I now plug this one instead of the mist into here and see the output, we can see the mist is getting further and further away from the camera, and we can see it's now only affecting the hill in the background. So this is some more adjustments we can do. I think maybe something like this is fine. Maybe turn this back down again, and I think maybe just add a little bit less. So this is before and this is after, and I think it just adds a little bit more depth to the image. I think maybe even a little bit less should be fine. Just push this back a little bit. Okay, now if we wanted to, we can then denoise that image. So let's move this over to here. Let's plug this into the image, and we can then denoise to see how that looks. It's going to take a minute to denoise, but we can then see the image clean up. There we go. And I think that's looking pretty cool. I also mentioned that there are other passes as well. If you remember, there's a bunch more stuff here. Now this will deserve its own tutorial on its own about what each one does. So let's just see what glossy indirect looks like. Let's just plug that into there. And this is going to be all the indirect information for all the glossy. And we can see that looks pretty crazy, but that's just simply the glossy information from all the objects. Now with this glossy indirect, we can also mix that in as well if we wanted to. So let's do Shift A and then search for mix color. And then I want to plug the screen that we did into here. I'm going to set this to add, and then I'm going to get the gloss indirect and plug that into here. Now we can see that all the glossy information is making the image brighter. So we can see a lot more glossy information. But now you'll notice that the glossy is also very noisy. So that will need to be denoised as well. But I think that looks quite interesting, but I don't think we really need any for now. We can introduce some glossy information if we wanted to. Actually, it looks pretty nice. I think this ball actually gets a lot more dimension to it with that enabled. So yeah, let's leave that on for now. There we go. And then I'm going to plug that back into the denoise and then denoise that entire image. Okay, I think that looks pretty cool. If we compare what it looks like to start with, we can see that looks quite nice, and now we've added a bit more dimension to it with the compositor. Okay, now I do think that the image is getting too bright because of adding some bright areas to it and then adding even more bright areas to it. It's getting a bit too bright. So now the final node I'm going to add for now is just A, and we can just do color and add and adjust, and then click on RGB curves. Let's move this over to here. I don't want it to go over the denoiser because that's a little bit slow. So let's just plug this into here for now. And now we can adjust this. So I'm going to just make a little bit of an S curve. Let's just bring this down. And let's bring this up. This is just like a very quick way to add some contrast, make the white areas a bit brighter and the darker areas a bit darker. And I can also bring this up if I wanted to, and that will basically make the black areas less black. But I think that's a bit too much. So I'm just going to bring this down, something like this. And then there's also two looks, so I think that film-like might be a little bit nicer because I find that the standard is a little bit too dark here, and in general that's still probably a little bit too dark, so let's just push this up, something like this. Now you don't want to go too crazy with this, but I think that looks great. And maybe one more node, so A, let's just type for hue saturation value, and then we can just adjust the saturation, we can adjust the hue, and we can adjust the value, which is basically brightness. Let's just decrease this just a tiny bit. Okay, and like before, let's plug all of that into the denoiser, and then I think that we're done. There's one thing which I think can be improved. When I zoom in, I see that this leg looks quite noisy, especially now that we've mixed in some of the glossy indirect into this, which is quite a noisy image. So I think to fix that, next time I'll probably render more samples. So I go to the render tab and I go to here and maybe try 1024 and see if that helps. All right, and there we go. So now we have the final image, and this is what I'm happy with. And now we want to maybe post this. So what do? We want to go to image, then we click save as image. And then we want to give it a name, such as incredible, beautiful 3D render, yay. And then what we want to do is go over to here, and we want to choose how we want to save it. If we want to do further editing, we can choose a TIFF 16-bit or a PNG 16-bit. And then they have a lot more information. Generally, I choose a TIFF. But if this is the final image, you're not going to do anything else to it. A JPEG is more than good enough to do that. So we can just click Save Image. And there we have it. We have our final image. I hope that you've enjoyed this course. I know that as the course went on, there were bits which I started speeding up because I found that I was doing the same things over and over again, such as the scaling, moving, scaling. I felt like I didn't really need to explain the shortcut keys I was pressing at that point. But if you do get stuck, please do reach out on our Discord group, and we are going to be more than willing to help you throughout this course. There's going to be people, including me, who are more than happy to help you throughout this course. But like I said, there's going to be parts of this course which are maybe a little bit more complicated than others, but don't get disheartened if you are just really struggling to make things work, or you don't fully understand why or how we got to the final product. Because the idea with 3D is, I know it is brand new, and all the concepts are totally different to like 2D art, for example. So it's kind of like a totally new concept you have to understand. And I can assure you that just over time, this will get easier and easier for you to the point where you won't even think about it. Okay, so where'd you go from now? Well, do check out iMesh. So we are an architectural visualization companies where we make an asset library, which looks something like this. And over here we have over 2,000 assets, which allows you to complete architectural visualization projects. And over on YouTube, we also have some free masterclasses, which can teach you how to make something like this. Or we have an exterior masterclass, which is almost 3 hours long, that teaches you how to make something like this. And these do go quite fast, but I do believe that now you've done this beginner course, that you should be able to achieve something like this if you wanted to. And I've been in the architectural visualization world for a very long time, and it is a very viable way to make some money. So if you are interested in making some side money, I do recommend you checking all this out. And what we offer here is a library of all pre-made assets. So when a client asks for you to create a room, generally you are not expected to make every single 3D model. There is no architectural visualization firm that always makes all of their assets. I guarantee that they all use some sort of library, and that's what we offer over at iMesh. So you can get it for $149. You can get over 2,000 assets, which is incredible value. So there are other websites, for example, some other 3D online websites like 3D Sky. They are basically a 3D library, but for 3D Studio Max software, not Blender, and each asset is about $7. So if you're going to imagine you buy 2,000 assets for $7, that's going to cost you $14,000. So hopefully you can get an idea of the kind of value that you can get by signing up to our library, which is only $149. And with that, I guarantee you'll be able to kickstart your archviz career. All you need to learn is lighting and cameras, and all the pre-made assets are done for you, and then you can start making money that way. At the very least, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and maybe sign up to our newsletter. You can get a free scene as well, and just to check out how all these things go together. And then we're going to be releasing more things as time goes on, and you'll be able to learn more and more specifically about architectural visualization, and hopefully start making some money in the industry. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to get to this point, and I guess I'll see you guys very soon.